Support for Alabama Aloud comes from Ernest and Hadley Booksellers of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, who strive to provide a unique selection of new, used, and rare books from local, regional, and international sources. Information about online orders at ernestandhadleybooks.com.
From Troy Public Radio, this is Alabama Aloud. I'm Don Noble. Alabama Aloud is the only podcast where you can hear Alabama stories read in their entirety. Today, I'll be reading The Great Amphibian by Michelle Richmond. Michelle Richmond, a native of Mobile and graduate of the University of Alabama, is the author of 2 volumes of stories and 6 novels. Richmond lived in San Francisco for a number of years, and this story is, in part, set there. Most of Richmond's fiction would be considered realistic, but The Great Amphibian is fanciful, whimsical, humorous. I was in Golden Gate Park watching the gentlemen race their model yachts on Spreckles Lake. I used to go there a lot to take my mind off things. The scene was always the same, a dozen or so men in their 70s, 80s, even 90s, decked out in fishing caps and khakis and sneakers, pacing the sidewalk, remote controls in hand. The men were always in a hurry, scurrying to keep up with their yachts, but the yachts themselves never went very fast. The yachts were so slow, in fact, not even the ducks seemed to be bothered by them. It was a small lake, man-made and gracefully shaped, seductively curvaceous, like the amoeba one studies in grade school. The lake was surrounded by a wide sidewalk. Along the edges of the sidewalk were several wooden benches with little brass dedication plaques, in loving memory of this or that person. There was even a bench devoted to someone's cat. The character of the lake changed from day to day, depending on the weather. On this particular afternoon, the placid surface was covered with a thin green film. There was a new guy at the lake. He was tall and broad, probably not a day over 65. His boat was brand new, bigger than the others, with a showy red hull beneath the billowing white sail. He was very tan, as if he'd spent the last 20 years of his life in Florida, and he wore a blue baseball hat instead of the regulation fishing cap. He was being aggressive, pulling all sorts of bogus maneuvers. At one point, he swung his yacht around and slammed into a smaller one that was attempting to pass. "Please get that monstrosity out of the way," said the fellow with the smaller boat. He had an old-fashioned mustache and dyed black hair, and he wore an odd pair of white gloves with pearl buttons at the wrists. Every time I went to Spreckles Lake, I'd been going twice a week for several months, ever since my husband left, this fellow was there. He had always struck me as the quiet, meek sort, so I was surprised to hear him challenge the new guy. "What did you say?" the new guy asked. "This is a gentleman's sport," the fellow with the white gloves said. "There is a protocol. Kindly move your boat." That's when the new guy said, "Get lost," and pushed the gentlemanly fellow into the lake. The man disappeared beneath the water for a few seconds. Then his head bobbed up, his knees, the white tips of his shoes, and he began to float. As soon as the men of the Model Yacht Club realized what had happened, they started steering their boats in and calling out for help, everyone except the new guy, who apparently still had his sights set on winning the race. By now, the fellow had floated several yards out. "Should someone go in to help him?" one man asked. The others shrugged their shoulders. I got the feeling that none of them went in for much physical activity. I was the only other person at the lake, so they all looked my way, but they quickly dismissed me because I was obviously very pregnant. 38 weeks, to be exact. 2 weeks to go, give or take. I was in no condition to jump into the lake and save the floating man. We all just stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. It was clear that no one had a cell phone or a rescue plan. Gradually, the men began taking their boats out of the water and drying them off in their careful, tender way. I could tell they were disappointed, but they couldn't very well go on racing their boats while one of their own was in a dire situation. The new guy pulled his yacht past the finish line and yelled, "I won!" But no one paid him any attention. "Why don't you jump in there and save him?" I said to the new guy. "After all, you're the one who pushed him in." "I did no such thing," the new guy said, pulling his baseball cap low on his forehead and frowning at me in a threatening way. He probably would have pushed me in, too, if I hadn't been so pregnant. He looked around furtively, then took his monster yacht out of the water and walked away. The fellow in the lake, who had drifted out about 15 yards, said, "Might someone lend me a hand?" "Can you swim?" asked one of the men of the Model Yacht Club. This seemed to strike the fellow with the white gloves as a novel notion. "I've never tried." Someone else offered, "This isn't the time to find out. Just float. The human body can float for an indefinite period of time. The key is to relax. The moment you panic, you sink." "You could try standing up," said a man with a tattoo of an eagle sprawled across his right arm. "It may not be very deep." "What if it is?" asked the floating man. "You're right," another man said, in a voice almost identical to Ronald Reagan's. "The safest bet is to just keep floating until something happens." The men of the Model Yacht Club deliberated for a minute, and finally agreed that yes, floating was the safest option. So we stood and watched as the gentlemanly fellow drifted farther away from us. In his plaid shirt, bright white sneakers, and white gloves, he looked like some unlikely freshwater creature hailing from another world. "How long do you think it will be before the situation improves?" the floating man asked. I detected a note of concern in his voice, but overall I thought he was being very dignified about the whole thing. "Don't worry," I called. "We'll wait here until you float to the edge, or until help arrives." I was surprised to hear my own voice. I wasn't in the yacht club, after all. If I wanted to, I could simply walk away. "Who was that?" asked the floating man. The men of the yacht club looked at me. "It was the pregnant lady," said one. He uttered the word pregnant in a whisper, as if it were some sort of divine condition deserving of respect. "Oh, of course, I've seen you here many times. How are you feeling?" "Fine." "Is it a boy or a girl?" "A boy." "That's wonderful," the floating man said. "I have 3 grandsons myself." We all sat down and waited, making conversation with the floating man. "It's only a matter of patience," someone called out to him. "By and by, you'll float back over this way, and we'll pull you out." "I'd appreciate that." "Just concentrate," said a man who was wearing very yellow socks. "On what?" came the reply from the middle of the lake. "On your favorite food, or a beautiful girl you had a very long time ago." The man in the yellow socks glanced at me. "Sorry, I'm just trying to help him focus." "No offense taken." It was a funny thing about being pregnant. Everyone just assumed that I was both physically and emotionally delicate, not to mention prudish. In the weeks before my husband left, he had become solicitous, plumping my pillows at night and fetching things from the kitchen, holding onto my arm when we walked, as if I might trip and fall at any moment. Although the hormonal changes made me lustier than usual, he refused to have sex with me, convinced he would harm either me or the baby. He even tried to stop cursing, and when he slipped up, he would apologize profusely. I sometimes wondered if the reason he left was that he simply couldn't live up to the saintly standards he had set for himself as a father-to-be. The gentleman continued to float. The sun went behind the clouds. No one came by. It was just us out there, me and the old guys and the floating man, and the wildlife, of course. The lake was a gathering place for fowl of many varieties, and I was always amazed at how well they got along. The pesky pigeons with their drugged-looking red eyes, the mallards with their emerald necks, the seagulls with black and white tail feathers resembling piano keys. A pigeon was resting on the floating man's stomach, and a black baby duck was perched on his forehead. It was all very peaceful. As I sat there, I began to think about my grandfather, who had been known throughout the Southeast decades before as the Great Amphibian. He earned this title by way of a special talent he had for disappearing into the water and reappearing hours later, completely unharmed. The first person to witness this particular feat was the girl who would become my grandmother. She was a student at Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia at the time, and she was rowing with her roommate on Foster Lake when she spotted an attractive man in his early 20s on the far side of the lake. He waved to her. She waved back. "I'm coming out there," he shouted. "Don't," she said, "it's deep. We'll come to you." Then he stepped into the lake. The strange thing was that he did not swim. He just stepped in and started walking. He was wearing all of his clothes, a seersucker suit with a white shirt and pale blue tie. His knees disappeared, his waist, his chest, his neck, and finally his head. She and her roommate thought it was a nifty trick until more than a minute passed and he did not emerge. They scanned the lake and saw no sign of him. There weren't any bubbles or ripples on the surface to indicate where he might be. They began to row in the direction where he'd been standing, but neither girl was skilled with the paddle, and they ended up going in circles. My grandmother went into a panic, thinking she had just witnessed a drowning. Then, about 7.5 minutes after he had stepped into the lake, my grandfather bobbed up beside their boat. "Hello," he said. His head rose so calmly over the surface of the water that he did not even seem to be moving his hands or feet. It was the strangest thing my grandmother had ever seen, and at that very moment she fell in love. He climbed into the boat and shared the girls' picnic lunch. 17 days later, the wedding ceremony was held on the front lawn of the campus. My grandmother begged her new husband to reveal the secret of how he had disappeared into the lake for 7.5 minutes without coming up for air, but he only said, "Most folks put too much store by oxygen." 10 months later, they had a son, my father, and soon after the birth, my grandfather lost his job. Deciding that her husband should put his aquatic talents to use for financial gain, my grandmother started printing flyers and calling friends, one of whom wrote a column for the Macon Star. On my father's 6th-month birthday, 29 skeptics showed up on the banks of Foster Lake, deposited a quarter into a cookie tin my grandmother had brought along for the occasion, and waited to see my grandfather walk into the water. The promise made in the newspaper column and on the flyer was that he would stay underwater for 6 minutes without coming up for air. But he astonished everyone by staying under for 9 minutes and 47 seconds. He repeated the trick for a larger audience a week later, only this time he made a different promise. He would walk all the way from one side of the lake to the other without coming up for air. It took 13 minutes and 12 seconds. When he emerged on the other side, a newspaper photographer took his picture. In the photograph, my grandfather is wearing a seersucker suit and pale tie, which hang dripping from his body. Likely the same suit and tie he wore on the day he met my grandmother. And his hair is slicked away from his face. He is smiling. The headline above the photograph reads simply, "The Great Amphibian." Thus he embarked upon a lucrative new career. "How do you do it?" a reporter once asked. My grandfather is said to have tipped his hat and replied, "It's simple, really. I just put one foot in front of the other." I never knew my grandfather because he disappeared before I was born. But as a child, I often heard the details of how he became the Great Amphibian. My father would always tell the story with a sort of awe, and after my father left, my mother began telling it. I think both of them wanted me to know that I had greatness in my blood, that the path leading to my birth was paved with golden sand. The water was his calling, my father used to say, rocking me in the big white chair by the window overlooking the wharf. "What is yours?" I never knew how to answer the question. I felt called to nothing, by no one, and I feared that I would live out my days without knowing my true purpose. From my bedroom window in those days, I could see the bay, stretching out cool and blue, and the sway-backed length of the Golden Gate Bridge, half obscured by fog, and far in the distance, the lonely island of Alcatraz. I knew that my grandfather had always dreamed of walking underwater the entire distance from San Francisco to Alcatraz. He had tried several times and failed. In the family album, there was a newspaper photo of him being rescued from the frigid bay waters by a Coast Guard boat, just 3/10 of a mile from his goal. According to my parents, it was a failure that he always regretted. And though in his lifetime he walked hundreds of miles beneath dozens of bodies of water in all kinds of weather, he always saw San Francisco Bay as his great defeat. The family legend was that my grandfather had met some dire fate in Lake Michigan during a family vacation, but there was no proof. His body was never recovered. Because no one could say for certain what had happened to him, I believed he could have gone anywhere, and he might very well still be alive. I imagined that he had returned at some point to San Francisco, that alone and without fanfare he had made the dangerous underwater trek to Alcatraz. As a child, I spent many afternoons staring out the window at the bay and imagining my grandfather, the Great Amphibian, stepping into the frigid water, walking and walking until he came to that eerie, abandoned island. In my mind, he had finally succeeded, without an enraptured audience, without a fanatical wife to cheer him on. I imagined him living alone on the terrible island, roaming the empty prison cells, walking to the city whenever he became bored or lonely or needful of supplies. Sometimes, strolling along the crowded downtown streets hand in hand with my father, and later, after my father had left, alone, I would watch for a thin, graying man in a drenched seersucker suit. For many years, I believed without doubt that I would one day run into him in Union Square or along the waterfront, and that he would immediately recognize me as his own, blood of his blood, granddaughter of the Great Amphibian. Hours passed. There was the sound of ducks squawking, and the men of the Model Yacht Club chatting, and the cars passing on Fulton beyond the line of trees. By and by, everyone began to leave. One had to go teach an adult education painting course at UC Extension. Another had a dinner party to attend. Another had a grandchild to babysit. I, being single, and on maternity leave from the law firm, was entirely without obligations. So I stayed. It grew darker. Sometimes the floating man and I talked, and sometimes we remained silent, listening to the wind in the eucalyptus trees. No one came by the lake. The Giants were fighting their way to the playoffs at Pac-Bell Park. A presidential debate was being broadcast on TV. The Dalai Lama was giving a speech at Yerba Buena. Bruce Springsteen was playing at the Great American Music Hall. It was one of those San Francisco days when everyone had somewhere else to be, leaving the streets and parks deserted. I always liked San Francisco best on those days because one had the feeling of living anonymously and alone in a great unpopulated city. "You can go home if you need to," the floating man said. I could tell he was just trying to be brave. He didn't really want to be left alone. "That's okay," I said. "It's pleasant here." "Won't your husband be worried?" "He died," I said. "My condolences." I felt guilty for lying to the floating man, but it was so much easier to say my husband had died than to say he had simply departed. What a shock it had been the day I came home from work to find a note on the dining room table. "You and the baby will be better off without me." His leave-taking came without warning. There had been no foreshadowing, no aberrant behavior that appeared in retrospect as a series of telltale clues. I was 4 months along, and we were presumably happy. I waited for him to return, certain that he was simply afraid and would soon realize his mistake. A month passed, 2, 3, and gradually it began to seem inevitable. Of course he had left. Of course I would raise this child alone. Wasn't that in keeping with family tradition? My grandfather, the Great Amphibian, had left his family after all. Just stepped into Lake Michigan one summer during a vacation to Chicago and started walking. My grandmother thought nothing of it, being used to his underwater escapades. She waited for him all morning, then through lunchtime and on into evening. By supper time she had to pack up. The children were hungry and sunburned. The lake at night was no place for a respectable family. She and the children waited in their hotel room for a week and finally went home, immersed in the cold grief of uncertainty. Her husband was never heard from again. My father left my mother and me as well. A week after my 10th birthday, he went on a business trip to Atlanta, from which he did not return. His sister, my aunt, left her husband and 3 children for a career in dentistry. It was the way it went among our clan, and the trick was to be the one who left rather than the one who was left behind. "How did it happen?" the floating man asked. "How did your husband die?" "A tragic hunting accident," I said. It was the first thing that came to me. For a while, neither of us spoke. At some point I checked my watch and saw that it was 8:15. The fog had moved in, shifting prettily through the green treetops and hovering over the green lake. The air was cold. "How are you doing out there?" I asked. "I've felt better." "Is there anything I can do to take your mind off things?" "Tell me a story," he said, "a very long one." So I told him the story of the Great Amphibian, how he became famous and made a good living for many years by going from state to state, lake to lake, walking underwater. I explained how my grandfather's celebrity earned him enough money to buy a house in Atlanta and another in San Francisco, where he tried and failed to walk to Alcatraz. I told the floating man about my grandfather's disappearance in Lake Michigan and his strange reappearance some years later on page 16 of the Bay Guardian. It was a small item in the News of the Weird column, and I would have missed the item altogether were it not for the intriguing subhead printed in bold letters, "Man or Fish." I read the paragraph over and over so many times it was etched permanently into my memory. 2 campers from New York City, whose fishing boat capsized in Big Moose Lake in the Adirondacks, were rescued Friday by an unidentified man. The drunken campers were flailing about in the water when a fully clothed man appeared beside them in the middle of the lake and escorted them to safety. Following the rescue, the man bowed cordially and disappeared once again into the lake. A witness at the campsite corroborated their story. Both campers were treated for hypothermia at a nearby hospital and released. When I saw this piece, I was a junior in college, majoring in pre-law, and I had just met the man who would one day become my husband, a graduate student in musicology. My courtship with this tall, thin man who played saxophone and didn't own a car was the first thing that had ever struck me with the sort of intensity that might be described as a calling. Evenings, we would have burnt coffee and soggy hash browns at a diner in the Mission, and as I sat across from him, listening to his inspired rants on the roots of the blues, I felt as if my long years of indirection had finally come to an end. What intrigued me most about the story in the Bay Guardian was the word escorted, which implied a certain casual grace, very much in keeping with what I knew of my grandfather. The fact that the rescuer was fully clothed, combined with the strange circumstances of his departure from the campers, convinced me beyond doubt that the Great Amphibian was alive and well. Was he living somewhere along the banks of Big Moose Lake, or had he merely been visiting? Was he in New York State by chance, or had he taken up permanent residence there? That was 8 years ago, I told the floating man. For several months afterwards, I tried to locate my grandfather. I called all the campsites around the lake, but no one knew a man who could walk underwater. Then I called directory assistants for every town and city in the state of New York, but there was no one listed by his name. Eventually, I gave up. At the end of my story, I heard a strange sound coming from the middle of Spreckles Lake. The floating man was snoring. I checked my watch. It was almost 9 p.m. I was hungry, and I had to pee, and I wanted to go home. I did not know what to do. I could not let the gentleman stay out there in the lake, floating through the night, but I could not leave him to find help. I realized that it was up to me to save him. But swimming was not my thing. I had never liked it. I remembered sitting on the steps of the shallow end of a dirty pool at kindercare when I was 6, refusing to get wet above the waist. For an entire summer, day after day, I ignored the exhortations of my swimming coach to go in. Finally, she told my mother that I could no longer attend classes, as I was demoralizing to the other children. A shame, my mother said to the swimming coach. Her grandfather, of course, was known as the Great Amphibian. Eventually, I did learn to swim, but not by choice. It was at Girls in Action camp the summer before my 6th grade year. One afternoon, 2 coconut-smelling counselors, one fat, one thin, picked me up by the arms and legs, carried me down to the end of the pier, and threw me in the water. "Swim for Jesus!" the thin girl yelled. "He died on the cross for you," the fat girl said. "Can't you at least swim for him?" I sputtered and dog-paddled and gasped for air. I felt that I was dying. But eventually I did swim, not for Jesus, but for Jordan Lamar, a member of the Royal Ambassadors who was watching from the desolate brown beach. Eventually I made it to shore. That was my first and last experience with swimming. Sitting alone by Spreckles Lake in the quiet of the evening, watching the sleeping man float, I remembered this Girls in Action pamphlet entitled, "You Too Can Be a Hero." The pamphlet featured drawings of peach-skinned blonde girls committing heroic acts, such as rescuing injured birds, helping old ladies cross the street, and witnessing to people who might otherwise go to hell. I had never done any of these things and had ended my 3 years of Girls in Action without a single hero badge on my uniform. On the day of my Girls in Action commencement, my mother didn't even bring a camera. She cried throughout the ceremony while other women's daughters received accolades and gave speeches. In the car on the way home, she said, by way of subtle accusation, "Your grandfather, remember, was known as the Great Amphibian." I said, "Not everyone can be great." I said this to provoke her, thinking that she would lecture me about how I could be great if only I weren't so lazy. Instead, she gave me a look that was painfully devoid of anger or confrontation and said, "I guess you're right. What say we go to Dairy Queen?" By that point, my father had already gone AWOL, and my mother often plied me with unhealthy snacks in order to make up for his absence. At Dairy Queen, I had a peanut butter parfait. The crumbled peanuts were stale, and the plastic spoon wouldn't reach all the way to the bottom of the cup. On that day, I became resigned to a life of mediocrity, and over time I realized that mediocrity suited me well. Perhaps my parents had been wrong all along, and greatness was not, after all, genetic. That night at the lake, it was not greatness I strove for. I did what I did out of fear. Fear of leaving the floating man on the lake to go for help, only to come back and find him drowned and dead. Fear of living with the consequences of my act of desertion. While I could abide old ladies crossing the street alone, injured birds dying in the woods, even the great unsaved masses going to hell, I could not abide the thought of that nice man from the Model Yacht Club dying alone in the lake, abandoned by everyone. I cannot say for sure why noble conviction struck me on this particular day, when I had lived my entire life without it. Perhaps some part of me did not want my unborn son to witness his mother in an act of cowardice. Whatever the reason, I took off my jacket and shoes, walked to the water's edge, sat down on the cool cement, and lowered myself into the lake. The water was cold and slippery. A fine green film coated my feet, my calves, my thighs. The moment my stomach touched the water, my baby began to kick. "I hear something," the floating man called. His voice was fearful, startled from sleep. "Is that you?" "Yes," I shouted. "I'm coming to get you." "Oh, thank heavens," he said. "I'm getting so cold." "How did you sleep?" I asked, trying to take his mind off his situation. "Oh, I didn't really sleep. I just dozed. That was a fine story you told about your grandfather. However did it end? Did you find him?" "I'll tell you another day." I didn't have the heart to tell him that I had already revealed the ending, and that he had slept right through it. Nor did I want to tell him that the great amphibian had never materialized, that after living 3 decades in the shadow of his greatness, I had yet to meet him. My feet touched the slimy cement bottom. I would be lying if I said I wasn't afraid, but it was a kind of manageable fear. I decided to just put one foot in front of the other, as my grandfather had done for so many years, and see what happened. The water reached my chest, my shoulders, my neck. I could feel the baby beneath my ribs, could feel the strength of his tiny hands and feet. An elbow, or was it a knee, traveled slowly across my stomach. At that moment, I believed that he would be a fine baby, a good son, and the blood of the great amphibian would flow through his veins. The water touched my chin, my mouth, my nose. I kept walking. I felt the water closing over the top of my head. Slowly, my lungs began to tighten, and in the tightness there was a kind of clarity, a vanishing of fear. I saw then that it was not so very far out to the middle of the lake. In the liquid darkness, I could just make out the shape of the floating man, his legs, his arms, his gloved hands, sprawled and waiting. The Great Amphibian was published in the collection A State of Laughter, Comic Fiction from Alabama, edited by Don Noble, published in 2008, and used here by permission of the author. We hope you don't keep Alabama Aloud all to yourself. Subscribe to our podcast and share it with a friend. Better yet, write us a review in the iTunes store. It helps other people find the podcast. Alabama Aloud is a production of Troy Public Radio and produced by Austin Toy and Kyle Gassett. Special thanks to Matt Clower, Buddy Johnson, Michelle Mowry, and Jennifer Horn. Alabama Aloud is made possible in part by a grant from the Alabama State Council on the Arts. So, until next time, when you'll hear more of Alabama read aloud, I'm Don Noble. Thanks for listening.